Glass shattered first, then laughter, the kind that cuts. I froze as Ethan said, "Relax, Maya, it was just a joke," while my name burned in a room full of faces. Someone replayed the clip of me trusting him with a secret, and the audio boomed like a verdict. I felt the floor tilt as Ethan flashed that easy grin that once meant safety. Jordan said, "Is this real?" And I heard my voice whisper, "He promised." Grace stood near the door, eyes narrowed, as if weighing the cost of silence. Ethan said, "You always take things too seriously," and the room hummed with phones raised like torches. The confession he coaxed from me last night now looped on a screen, each word stripped of context. I said, "Turn it off," but my plea drowned under the chorus of rewinds. He leaned close and said, "It's content, Maya, not betrayal," and the word content snapped something tender in me. I remembered our late nights and soft vows and felt them crumple into noise. He laughed again, bright and hollow, and the sound made the world feel suddenly very small. The clip starts again, my voice small in a quiet car, telling Ethan the one thing I swore to protect. He said, "I needed content, Maya," as if that word could rinse the stain from his hands. I remembered the steering wheel under my fingers and the way I trusted the silence between us. Jordan said, "Did you ask her?" And the room tilted toward ethics like a broken compass. Ethan said, "Everyone shares everything," and I tasted metal behind my teeth. Grace said, "Turn it off," and her voice was the first warm thing in the cold. Someone laughed and I felt that sound reach for my throat. I said, "You promised me," and the promise rose like a ghost I could not hold. He shrugged, a little showman bow, and the crowd rewarded him with a chorus of pings. I thought of the nights we traded secrets like lanterns in the dark. He said, "It's harmless," and I watched the harm walk the room in my shoes. The screen brightened and with it, our history dimmed to a cruel punchline. I tried to rewind the night to where trust still lived, but the reel snagged at his grin. Ethan said, "You always make me the villain," and I felt the word always stab old memories. I remembered the time he defended me when rumors curled like smoke. I said, "I believed you," and belief sounded like a broken wing. Jordan stepped closer and said, "This isn't a bit," as if naming it could disarm the blade. Ethan laughed, and the laugh rang like glass on concrete. Grace said, "Consent matters," and her eyes tracked the phones as if they were sparks near dry brush. I asked, "Why me?" And the question felt smaller than my heartbeat. He said, "Because you're honest," and I watched honesty get sold for views. The crowd shifted, restless with attention hunger. The audio from the clip rose again, and somewhere inside it, I heard the last time we were still us. He raised his phone and the room leaned in like tide to the moon. Ethan said, "Let the audience decide," and handed our friendship to strangers with hungry thumbs. I said we were never content, but the words sounded fragile against the noise. Jordan said, "You're crossing a line," and stepped between us with a breath that shook. Grace said, "End it now," and her voice was a rope tossed to a drowning shore. Ethan smirked and said, "It's performance," as if performance were holy enough to absolve betrayal. I saw the boy who once held my backpack in the rain, and he flickered behind the man with the camera. I whispered, "You knew what this would do," and my throat burned like winter. He said, "You'll thank me later," and the future he promised felt like a locked room. The laughter sputtered, thinner now, and the video's glow painted my hands with pale doubt. Somewhere, my trust fell, and did not land. The party thinned to murmurs, but the damage kept speaking. "Hi, owl," I said, "delete it," and I heard a quiver I did not recognize as mine. Ethan said, "It's already everywhere," and the word everywhere hollowed out my ribs. Jordan said, "Then apologize," and the command landed like a clean blade. Grace said, "You can still choose decency," and the room paused as if listening for a verdict. Ethan rolled his shoulders and said, "People love drama," and the lights felt crueler for agreeing. I remembered our first inside joke and how it used to heal bad days. I said, "You turned my friendship into your joke," and the line tasted like ash. He looked away, chasing the nearest smile, and I saw the door, I would have to walk through. Jordan touched my sleeve and said, "You don't owe him your silence." Grace nodded once, and the nod felt like a map. Somewhere past the windows, sirens rose, and I wondered if they were for us. The memory played like a film too fragile to touch, a sunlit afternoon where trust was effortless. Ethan said, "Race you to the fence," and his laughter carried across the field like a promise. I ran with grass brushing my knees and felt his hand pull me over the fence before mine slipped. I said, "You'll never let me fall," and I believed it more than gravity. Jordan cheered from behind, his voice small but steady, the sound of a third heartbeat in our little world. We tumbled into the dirt and Ethan grinned with dirt streaked across his cheek, eyes shining with loyalty. Grace had watched from a porch, her book half closed, and she said, "You two are impossible." In that moment, we were only children bound by laughter, not years or betrayals. Ethan said, "Best friends forever," and pressed his hand to mine like it was a vow. I said, "Forever," and the word stitched itself into the sky above us, bright and whole. Night fell years later, but the bond still glowed with small rituals. I remembered a blanket fort lit with flashlights, shadows dancing like secrets. Ethan said, "Promise me you'll tell me everything," and the torchlight turned his face to something sacred. I whispered, "Always," while the sound of rain pressed against the roof above us. Jordan peeked through the gap and said, "Don't leave me out," his laughter bubbling in. Grace knocked on the wall and said, "Quiet down before you wake everyone." We laughed harder, muffling it with pillows, and I thought joy was endless. Ethan's hand brushed mine and he said, "We'll never drift apart," and I wanted to believe more than anything. The rain deepened, the flashlight flickered, but our bond burned bright, wrapped in the scent of wet earth and warm blankets. The years rolled forward, and memories stacked like Polaroids in a shoebox. I saw us at graduation, caps in hand, a promise of futures unfolding. Ethan said, "We'll still call every night," and his eyes shone with the courage of beginnings. I said, "Distance won't break this," even as my throat ached with the word. Jordan clapped us both on the back and said, "You'll get sick of each other before you drift." Grace said, "Nothing lasts unless you fight for it," her tone sharper than celebration. We posed for pictures, arms around shoulders, and I felt the warmth of belonging. Ethan squeezed my hand once, and the gesture carved itself into memory as a pledge. The music of cheers, the rustle of gowns, the smell of fresh grass, it all folded into a moment that felt unbreakable. Life after school drew new faces into our circle, but one stood apart like a spark. I remembered the first time I saw Lily, her smile unfolding in sunlight. Ethan said, "She's interesting," and his tone carried a weight I didn't name. I laughed and said, "Don't get ahead of yourself," even as curiosity stirred in me too. Jordan teased, "Both of you staring. That can't end well." Grace watched silently, her eyes narrowing as if she already knew. Lily said, "It's nice to finally meet you," and her voice was warm without knowing the storm it would one day carry. Ethan leaned in closer than usual, and I felt the ground beneath shift slightly. The bond was still intact, but a seed had been planted, and the air felt heavier, though no one else noticed. There were nights we told stories under the stars, swearing the world could never break us. Ethan said, "This is what forever feels like," and his words wrapped around the firelight. I whispered, "Don't ever forget tonight," and the sky seemed to listen. Jordan strummed a guitar softly, saying, "We'll remember this when we're old." Grace added, "Or when everything changes," her voice quiet as smoke. Lily leaned closer, her hair catching firelight, and said, "You all have something rare." The warmth of the flames hid the shadows gathering, but in hindsight, I can see them flicker. We were together, woven tight, believing in promises too fragile for the weight of years. Morning broke on a threadbare promise, and the first crack sounded like a missed call. Ethan said, "Signal was trash," while my screen showed 3 green dots that never became words. I said, "You could have told me," and my voice tried to stay small enough to survive. Jordan said, "You okay?" As he slid coffee across the table, eyes scanning the dents in my calm. Grace said, "You've been canceling a lot," and the truth settled between us like rain. Ethan laughed and said, "You all worry too much," but the laugh felt rented. Lily said, "Maybe he's tired," and her softness landed like a bandage over a bruise. I said, "Tired people still keep promises," and Ethan's gaze drifted to his buzzing phone. He said, "It's nothing," and nothing carried more weight than anything. The day kept moving, but my trust lagged behind, limping. The excuses multiplied like shadows at noon, short and sharp. Ethan said, "I'm editing all night," and his eyes flashed with the fever of applause not yet earned. I said, "We planned this for weeks," and the calendar on my wall felt foolish for believing. Jordan said, "We can reschedule," but the word "we" sounded lonelier than it used to. Grace said, "He's choosing something else," and silence agreed. Lily said, "He's chasing a dream," and the dream pressed its heel into my ribs. Ethan added, "It's just a phase," and phases became a shield I could not pierce. I said, "Show me where I fit," and the room left my question unanswered. He said, "You know you're important," while his thumb hovered over a notification that glowed like a lure. The night leaned in and listened to us drift. The jokes began as paper cuts. I pretended not to feel. Ethan said, "Maya cries at movie trailers," and the room chuckled as if I had volunteered to be tender. I said, "You told me that was sweet," and sweetness turned to bait. Jordan said, "Not cool," but his voice got edited out by louder smiles. Grace said, "You're making her small," and the word "small" fitted itself to the corners of my chest. Lily said, "He didn't mean harm," while meaning wandered off without its leash. Ethan said, "It's just our bit," and I searched the calendar for when the bit had been born. I said, "I never agreed to be your punchline," and the air thinned. He grinned, and the grin looked like a mask that stuck too well. The distance turned measurable in drafts and secrets. Ethan said, "Just talking strategy with Lily," and my chest mapped routes I had never walked. Lily said, "It's about outreach," and the word stretched thin. I said, "We used to plan together," and the past pressed its palm to the glass. Jordan said, "Loop Maya in," and the loop felt broken before it closed. Grace said, "Transparency could save this," and transparency stayed unread. Ethan added, "You'll see it when it's ready," and ready sounded like a door with my name scraped off. I said, "I'm not a problem to manage," and he blinked as if surprised by my edges. The night hummed with unshared drafts, and my trust learned how to measure silence. By the time the meeting happened without me, the truth stopped hiding. Ethan said, "It was last minute," and last minute meant planned to the second. I said, "You knew I'd show up," and the chair kept my shape without my voice. Lily said, "We can brief you later," and later felt like never given a friendly coat. Jordan said, "This isn't leadership," and the table carried his words to a dull shore. Grace said, "You are erasing her," and the room blinked as if the lights had flickered. Ethan said, "Don't be dramatic," and drama waved from the doorway like an invited guest. I said, "I am done pretending this is a phase," and the syllables landed like nails. The silence after was heavier than all our laughs put together. The truth arrived, not with thunder, but with a notification. Ethan said, "Don't check that," but my hand was already on the screen. A video played, my secret framed by his edits, laughter folded into captions. I said, "You filmed me?" and my pulse stuttered. Jordan said, "That's private," his voice cutting through the static. Grace said, "This is beyond careless," and her words cracked like glass. Lily whispered, "You didn't tell her?" and guilt stained the air. Ethan said, "It was harmless," but the word trembled. I said, "You built your stage out of me," and the silence that followed sounded like applause for betrayal. The night felt smaller, the walls leaning closer, and every shared memory now lived with strangers. The betrayal grew legs and walked the room as laughter erupted again, not from mouths, but from the video looping. Ethan said everyone liked it, as if likes could weigh more than trust. I said, "They laughed because you told them to," and my voice cracked like a snapped wire. Jordan slammed his palm to the table and said, "Delete it now," but Ethan didn't move. Grace said, "You crossed a line," and kept walking, her anger steady as stone. Lily said, "This wasn't what I meant," but the plea dissolved into noise. Ethan added, "It's content, not cruelty," while cruelty smiled in the glow of his edits. I said, "You turned me into material," and my chest folded inward. He shrugged, the kind of shrug that meant he had already chosen the applause. Then the twist cut deeper. Ethan said, "It wasn't only about you," and his eyes darted toward Lily. My breath froze as the reel shifted. Lily said, "You dragged me in too," her voice shaking. I said, "So that's why you were both quiet," and the silence confessed more than their mouths ever could. Jordan said, "This is manipulation," and his fists tightened. Grace said, "He used both of you," and the truth landed heavy. Ethan said, "We're a team," but his grin betrayed it. Lily looked at me and said, "I never agreed to be his shield," and I felt her shame mix with mine. I said, "You chose my trust as currency," and the wound turned into fire. Ethan looked away, and I saw the mask slip, revealing the envy beneath. Ethan's mask cracked with the force of his own arrogance. He said, "I made you visible," and the words dripped poison. I said, "You made me a spectacle," and the word spectacle echoed like thunder. Jordan said, "You're proud of this?" his disbelief shaking the floor. Grace said, "This isn't friendship, it's exploitation," her tone final as a verdict. Lily said, "Stop pretending this was kindness," her voice sharp enough to cut. Ethan shouted, "You all benefited from me," but his voice cracked under the weight of lies. I whispered, "I never asked for fame," and the whisper carried heavier than his yell. The air turned brittle, sharp with things broken beyond repair. The knife twisted when Ethan leaned in with a final reveal. He said, "They've always laughed at you. I just showed them why, and the cruelty left no disguise." I said, "You weaponized everything I trusted you with," and my chest hollowed. Jordan said, "This is unforgivable," his voice ringing like a gavel. Grace said, "You've destroyed what you can't rebuild," and her tone sealed the judgment. Lily said, "You made us complicit," her eyes filled with tears. Ethan smirked, but the smirk trembled like glass ready to shatter. I whispered, "You were my brother," and the word brother broke apart. The twist was no longer hidden, it lived in every silence that followed, and the room carried the sound of endings. The storm broke all at once, words turning into weapons. Ethan said, "You're overreacting," and his tone slashed sharper than any blade. I shouted, "You broke me for views," and my voice shook the air like thunder. Jordan slammed the table and said, "Enough lies," his anger filling the cracks in the room. Grace said, "Face what you've done," and her eyes carried no escape. Lily whispered, "This is spiraling," but her voice was drowned by the clash. Ethan said, "You should be grateful," and the word grateful stung like salt in an open wound. I said, "Grateful for being humiliated," and silence flinched. The confrontation ripped every seam of us open, and the night pulsed like a storm refusing to end. Years of loyalty collapsed in sentences heavy with betrayal. Ethan said, "You needed me," and the arrogance filled every corner. I said, "I needed a friend, not a stage," and my words cracked open years of silence. Jordan said, "You thrived on her pain," his voice fierce with truth. Grace said, "You think cruelty is art," and her judgment hit like a hammer. Lily said, "You lied to both of us," her eyes glassy with grief. Ethan shouted, "You wouldn't matter without me," and his voice cracked under its own venom. I said, "I mattered before you, and I'll matter after you," and strength rose like fire in my chest. The room buzzed with fury, the storm outside echoing the one inside. Ethan raised his phone like a weapon, recording as if the argument itself was his masterpiece. I said, "Even now, you make pain into content," and my chest ached. Jordan said, "Put it down," stepping between us, his body tense as a shield. Grace said, "This isn't just selfish, it's cruel," and her words carved deeper than any glare. Lily said, "Why can't you stop?" trembling. Ethan said, Because this is who I am, and for the first time, the mask dropped completely. I whispered, "Then you were never my friend." And the room fell into a silence colder than the storm outside. The confrontation burned like a pyre, consuming the trust that once lived here. The breaking point came not with screams, but with the silence that followed them. Ethan said, "Say what you want, they're still watching," and the words rang hollow. I said, "Then let them watch you lose everything," and my voice steadied. Jordan said, "He's done," each syllable heavy as steel. Grace said, "He'll never own what he's broken," her tone final. Lily said, "I don't want to be part of this," stepping away with trembling resolve. Ethan tried to laugh, but it broke halfway, a sound brittle as glass. I said, "This ends here," and the air seemed to seal around the words. The storm outside roared its agreement, thunder cracking like applause for endings. The storm inside reached its peak as everything shattered at once. I said, "You don't get to write my story," and my chest burned with release. Ethan shouted, "Without me you're nothing," but his words bounced back, empty. Jordan said, "She's stronger without you," his voice steady. Grace said, "You'll be remembered for this betrayal," and the weight of it pressed Ethan down. Lily said, "We trusted you, and you destroyed it," her tears falling like the rain outside. Ethan looked around and found no one standing with him. I whispered, "This friendship is dead," and the silence that followed was louder than thunder. The climax left us in ruins, the storm echoing our collapse. Dawn found the city rinsed clean while my chest still carried thunder. Ethan said, "We can fix this," and the promise sounded like scrap metal dragged across stone. I said, "You can't edit the past into mercy," and the morning light refused to soften him. Jordan said, "Walk away, Maya," and his voice made leaving feel possible. Grace said, "Closure is a choice," and the words settled like a steady hand on my back. Lily said, "I'm sorry," and the apology drifted between us like pale smoke. Ethan said, "People move on," but the way he said people kept me out of the circle. I said, "I will move on without you," and the sentence unlocked something rusted. Silence arrived, not empty, but shaped like a boundary. The sun pushed through cloud and drew a line across the floor, and I stepped to the brighter side. I packed the fragments of myself into small acts that asked nothing of applause. Jordan said, "Eat first," setting toast by my elbow like a quiet shield. Grace said, "Block him," and the words sounded like laying brick on a strong foundation. Lily sent a message that read, "I'll testify if you need," and the offer felt like clean rain. I said, "I need space," and space opened like a door I could finally close behind me. Ethan wrote, "We're bigger than this," and the plural felt fraudulent. I drafted a statement and deleted it because my dignity did not owe an audience. Jordan said, "We'll handle logistics," and the we finally held. Grace said, "Choose what heals, not what reacts," and my pulse slowed. I breathed, and breath returned like a friend that had waited outside all night. I returned to the places that remembered me before betrayal learned my name. The bookstore bell chimed, and the smell of paper welcomed me without questions. Jordan said, "You love this aisle," and we stood by memoirs that survived harder storms. Grace said, "Write it for yourself first," and the advice slipped into my pocket like a tool. I said, "I will not explain my pain for views," and the sentence straightened my spine. Lily texted, "Proud of you," and pride arrived gentler than pity. Ethan posted another clip, but his echo no longer reached this quiet. I chose a journal, heavy enough to anchor new tides. Jordan said, "One page at a time," and the math of healing finally added up. I smiled without flinching, and the smile held. Apologies arrived in drafts that never learned to stand. Ethan said, "I didn't mean harm," and meaning sat outside the door in the rain. I said, "Impact is louder than intent," and the words echoed steady. Jordan said, "You owe restitution," and truth nodded from the corner. Grace said, "Accountability is action," and the sentence clicked like a latch. Lily said, "Take it down," and the demand wore steel. Ethan said, It's complicated, but the only complication was his refusal to change. I wrote, remove every clip and confirm, and my hand did not shake. The cursor blinked like a metronome, keeping time with resolve. I sent it, and sent the boundaries after it. Quiet followed, the kind that promises more than it threatens. The first night I slept, the city still hummed, but the hurt stopped shouting. Jordan said, "You did the hard thing," and the words tucked the blanket around my ribs. Grace said, "Healing isn't linear," and the graph in my mind softened its angles. Lily said, "You taught me to name harm," and the lesson felt mutual. Ethan's message arrived at 3 a.m., thin and belated, asking for a talk. I let it pass like a siren on a distant road, and chose my own silence. I said, "Tomorrow I start again," and tomorrow answered from the window with a pale promise. The night held, and inside it, I held too. When sleep came, it carried no footage, only a shoreline I could finally reach. The city moved on as if nothing had split, but I carried the fracture quietly. I walked streets where Ethan and I once laughed, and the echoes felt hollow. Jordan said, "Memories fade slower than people," and his words steadied the ache. Grace said, "You don't have to erase him to heal," but I wanted to erase the version of me that trusted too easily. Lily said, "The past can't be undone, but you can choose what remains," and I folded her sentence into my chest like a fragile note. I said, "He was my best friend," and the phrase tasted like ash. The air turned cool, and with it, I realized scars can guide as much as they ache. Closure came not in words but in symbols. I returned to the fence where Ethan once pulled me over, and the wood was older, splintered. Jordan said, "We all grew up here," his voice heavy with nostalgia. Grace said, "Places change when people do," and her hand brushed the rough wood. Lily said, "It still holds your laughter," and the memory lifted faintly from the soil. I said, "It also holds the weight of betrayal," and the fence seemed smaller now. Ethan wasn't there, but his absence weighed as loud as presence. I traced the grain with my fingers and whispered, "I'll climb alone this time." The act was quiet but final, a symbolic closure written on the old boards. The silent witness finally spoke. Grace said, "I watched the cracks form, and I stayed quiet," and her words cut deeper because they came late. Jordan said, "Silence is safer until it isn't," his tone raw with guilt. Lily said, "We all saw pieces of the truth but didn't piece them together," and the confession ached. I said, "You couldn't have stopped him," though part of me still wondered. Grace's eyes held mine and said, "But I could have helped you carry it." The statement softened the blame and reshaped it into understanding. Maybe gay. For the first time, I felt less alone with the weight. The witness became a companion in healing, and that mattered more than the timing. The final reflection unfolded beneath a quiet sky. I said, "Friendship isn't meant to be currency," and the words floated steady. Jordan said, "You gave more than he knew," and his voice carried pride. Grace said, "You found your strength through loss," and her tone was almost gentle. Lily said, "You reminded us what loyalty means," and her eyes softened. I stood taller, my chest no longer bent under betrayal. Ethan's absence was no longer the wound but the scar. I said, "I'll remember the laughter but not let it excuse the cruelty," and the sentence felt like both justice and mercy. The group nodded, and for the first time, the circle held without him. The last words were not shouted, but whispered into the night. I said, "He didn't just betray me, he betrayed every version of us we could have been," and the truth carved itself into the dark. Jordan stayed silent. The kind of silence that agrees without needing sound. Grace placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch heavy with solidarity. Lily said, "Then let him live with the echo," and her voice steadied the air. I looked out over the city and felt the scar settle into place. It would ache, but it would no longer own me. The story closed not with peace, but with power reclaimed. The final blow echoed in my chest like a bell tolling, steady and unforgettable,